People often view propaganda in a negative light. Sure, the idea can have various negative connotations amongst the general populace, but sometimes that's not always the case. During World War II, animation was often used to paint a more satirical look at the serious nature of war, whilst still making it comical for younger audiences. This time period was more monumental towards not only American society, but to the animation industry as well. Arguably, the more notable cartoons were made by companies such as Warner Brothers and Disney. Both companies featured their characters undergoing the harsh reality of war as a whole. From instructing people on basic war procedures to the advertising of war bonds, these are the cartoons that shaped America during one of history's darkest periods. Animation prior to the 1940s has often been regarded as a primitive time into the look form. Animation as an art form has been in circulation since prehistoric times, often with cave paintings depicting tribal artwork. These would mainly be seen in walls of caves. However, the normal form of animation that people would often associate with the industry today wouldn't come in circulation until the 19th century, with the introduction of a device called the magic lantern. The magic lantern was a device that almost resembled a standard film projector, in which light would project onto a wall or any flat surface and would show a film. Another such device was called the zoetrope, which was a wheel that you would spin, hence showing a moving picture, often showcasing a man running or riding a horse. The first animated cartoon that wouldn't be released until the year 1906, with the film Humorous Phases of Funny Faces. This cartoon was monumental in the industry because it was often considered to be the first cartoon to be released in theaters, and it was considered to be one of the first films to use stop motion through simple chalkboard drawings. However, one question still remains. How do these ideas come into play with the context of World War II? With advancements in technology and art as a whole ultimately continued to shape the industry, with most studios now switching to more surreal slapstick and an ink and paper medium, this would be the essential template for the following cartoons to come. December 7th, 1941. The Japanese unleashed a surprise ambush on the naval base of Pearl Harbor. This was one of the many warning signs of war. After the attack, then-President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivers his famous Day of Infamy speech. This reveals to the nation that America has gone to war with Japan. Where do these cartoons come into play at this? During the early years of the war, most cartoons were your standard cartoon violence affair, often portraying most militarized combat as slapstick. Most of these actions would be done in with comedic orchestral music playing in the background. Other cartoons would often provide helpful safety instructions. The most common of such is having various characters shout, "Turn out the lights," which was a common phrase that was mainly used during air raid drills. The overall main idea of simple propaganda at the time was persuading the audience into assisting the war effort. Some cartoons often portrayed some characters planning what was called victory gardens. This was done for homemade food production, such as fruits and vegetables. One cartoon featured Popeye the Sailor planting such various vegetables. Another way this was done was through scrap metal donations. Another famous cartoon features Daffy Duck in a scrapyard preaching about how scrap metal should be used for the war effort. Overall, the most notorious form of such from these earliest cartoons would be the advertising of war bonds. Most cartoons during the time period would often try to sell the importance of war bonds through fun and engaging ways for younger audiences and or adults. The most notable of such was the song sung by Bugs Bunny, which actually was one of the more popular songs from the time period. Despite all these safety measures that these citizens would endure, how did these cartoons aid the soldiers whilst fighting? More or less, the real question is, how did cartoons entertain the Allied forces? Arguably the earliest example of such was the series known as Private Snafu. Private Snafu was a series of shorts made by Warner Brothers, first starting in 1943. These cartoons provided a means of entertainment for soldiers, but they also served some educational value. Most of these cartoons often informed soldiers about deception, health and safety, and standard military procedures. These cartoons were mostly written by Dr. Seuss. The character of Private Snafu was often characterized as a bumbling idiot, often seen in most of the shorts, often doing most normal things wrong. These cartoons also often featured racist caricatures of the enemies, especially the Japanese, with their common stereotype of slanted eyes and big buck teeth. The impact of Private Snafu led to U.S. forces being rather successful in combat. This was due to how the character often did these things incorrectly, advising the soldiers not to condone such actions. Arguably, the most famous shorts were The Homefront, Booby Traps, Deception, and Censored. So far, we've looked at the overall impact of World War II propaganda as a whole. However, during the later years of the war, there would be a large tonal shift in which these cartoons would be portrayed. Most cartoons were now focused on satirizing the then fascist leaders of the Axis powers, mainly Germany's Hitler, Japan's Yamamoto, and Italy's Mussolini. All three had various accompanying stereotypes. Again, mentioning before with Private Snafu, these cartoons would feature the offensive Japanese stereotype of slanted eyes and buck teeth. However, it also featured the stereotype of the Germans being hyper-aggressive, as well as treating Hitler like he was their god or something. But with the Italians, they were treated more like big-bodied individuals with smaller heads. Often before the U.S. fought the Germans, they mainly took shots of Japan, seeing as how they were the common enemy at the time. The most common stereotype, as mentioned before, was the small, slanted eyes with the buck teeth. This was best seen in 1943's Tokyo Jokyo, in which they portrayed Japanese society in a rather negative manner. Released in 1943, the anti-Japanese war cartoon Tokyo Jokyo became one of the more notable anti-Japanese films from the time period. Created by Warner Brothers, this cartoon is a parody of newsreels on Japanese soldiers, showcasing the various lives in which they held. Although, continuing mentionings before, the depictions of Japanese soldiers in these cartoons was rather offensive, continuing with the similar stereotypes of buck teeth, small slanted eyes, and pure incompetence, which is essentially what this cartoon aimed to appeal at. Each segment featured in the cartoon was a parody of a news story. This cartoon was infamous for its various racist portrayals towards the Japanese. Arguably the most notable cartoon released during World War II was 1943's Der Fuhrer's Face. Der Fuhrer's Face was an anti-Germany cartoon produced by Walt Disney. It was essentially adapted from the song Der Fuhrer's Face, which aired on various radio stations back in the 1940s. The cartoon opens with a band of Nazis singing the song of the same name. We cut to Donald being forced to awaken and live the atrocious lifestyle of Germans, such as being forced to eat stale bread, being forced to read Mein Kampf, being forced to constantly salute to their Lord and Savior, Adolf Hitler. Donald is then taken to the factory where he is forced to manufacture shells for the German military. Honestly, this was home to one of the funniest scenes in any of these cartoons. Whilst Donald is making these shells, he accidentally gets smacked by a larger one. All this is done whilst he's being held at gunpoint from the soldiers. After a while, Donald begins to lose his mind as these surreal images begin to like flash on the screen. Honestly, like the most notable one is him being beaten by a shell. The end of the cartoon shows Donald awakening from his nightmare, saying that he's proud to be an American and not one of those Nazis. Arguably, this cartoon, albeit kind of dated, still lives on in animation history, as well as the history of propaganda as a whole. As the war continued to rage, propaganda became more and more mainstream. But ultimately, this wasn't to last forever. The war ended in good strides for the Allied forces in August of 1945, with the Germans surrendering and the Japan already failing. And after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, most, if not all, these cartoons previewed at the end of the war were often portrayed like parties symbolizing the victories of what was to come. Why was this the case? Well, if you're looking at the idea of World War II propaganda as a whole, these cartoons were to help with people understand like what's going on in the world. Sure, these times were unprecedented, but people needed a form to be entertained. The overall impact of these cartoons was that it showcased the most serious matters in a comedic fashion, and also pioneered mainstream these studios like Warner Brothers and Disney. It also really introduced animation as a media to a wider audience. I mean, you could say back then animation was mainly geared towards families, but thanks to World War II, anyone of all ages can enjoy these cartoons. And are most of these cartoons still regarded as classics? Yeah, you could say that. Although some of them may be offensive to today's standards, they're still worth a watch. I would honestly take time out of your day and just do some research. You'll be surprised in what you can find in such short amount of time.